So there's a lot of attention in international relations today on Russia and China and their role in the world. And one of the knottiest problems in our field is the question of what constitutes a revisionist state. So I want to give a simple definition of a revisionist state and then have my colleagues talk about whether it makes sense and whether Russia and China are revisionist states. A revisionist state is a state that is dissatisfied with the international status quo and with its position within it. So first, John, is that a fair definition of a revisionist state? And if it is, are Russia and China today revisionist states?
I think the answer is yes and yes. I think revisionism is, as you say, it's a state that a revisionist state is one that is unhappy with the existing order, that wants to change the existing order. So in that sense, it doesn't want to live in the status quo, in the existing system. And you could see when we come to Russia and China that that's true, that Russia and China in different ways are unhappy, have grievances against the existing system. Russia, under Putin, has a list of grievances that go to the fact that they collapsed after the end of the Cold War and were left to be a second-rate power and lost their empire or their Eastern European system and are either threatened or unhappy with the Western system as such. So you have Russia actively intervening and trying to make life difficult for the liberal democracies in the West, indeed intervening in Western elections and being less receptive to Western NGOs and civil society at home and abroad. China may be so in some sense Russia is more of a spoiler. It's unhappy, but it doesn't have a full revisionist agenda for changing the system. It's more trying to make those who are at the center of the system less happy, if you will, less capable of achieving their goals. China, as we talk about in the book, rising states, long-term shifts in the system of world politics driven by the rise and decline of states. China should be case number one for a state that sees its long future, over 50, 100 years, as being one where it increasingly takes center stage and seeks to recast the international order, such as the way the United States did after World War I and after World War II. Finally, you have to ask the question, is the United States a fully satisfied status quo state? And one would have to say that may not be true either. The U.S. may be revisionist in its own way. I can think of this in two senses. The U.S. as the head of a international order, as it's been, that is full of trade relations and active efforts to bring countries into the order, to promote democracy, to try to universalize human rights standards to non-Western states. Looking at the United States from Africa or Asia or Latin America on various occasions over the last 70 years, you could see the U.S. as the revisionist state. It's the one that's trying to upset the apple cart. And then secondly, today, the United States, at least the current administration and certain factions in the United States are in turn trying to rethink America's leadership role, perhaps rejecting its own system. So in that sense, the U.S. may be revisionist against its own status quo created international order.
Joe, does this distinction between revisionists and status quo states make sense to you? How do you think about it?
It does largely, although I would perhaps add as an addendum to that or an additional point to that, the idea in my own mind when I think of this issue, I think of a spectrum in which states may rest on a continuum from status quo orientation to revisionist orientation, and therefore in many instances particular states in intermediate points will have a combination of some foreign policy interests that require revisionism, some status quo. Russia, for example, I agree with you, has revisionist orientation, perhaps to its standing in Eastern and Central Europe. However, I'm quite confident that it is a status quo power when it comes, for example, to which country should have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and a veto capacity. In that case, Russia is a status quo country. In terms of further proliferation of nuclear weapons, I think the evidence so far is that Russia is a status quo state. So states have, I think, sometimes a combination of interests that fall in that spectrum between, I mean, we've had some really strong cases of revisionist states during the 1920s and 1930s, of states that really wanted to overturn the international order, at least in their regions. And I think we have less of that today. So they would be the extreme cases with other countries. More today, I think we see countries falling within the two extremes. The other point I would make about China is that it's a great problem for students of international relations. I agree with you that that China does have some pretty strong revisionist orientations. And it's ironic because the contemporary international order has been extraordinarily enabling for China to become a successful, powerful, economically more advanced state. And yet it still has this dissatisfaction and preference for status quo revision. And so there's a certain irony there that I think students reading our book will encounter that issue, and as they go forward and think about world politics, that would certainly be a contribution if they could help us understand why a successful country can nonetheless become dissatisfied with its circumstances and with the status quo in which it finds itself.